Can you talk to us about the divine commands of violence?
Ooh, that was a difficult chapter to write. It's one that people have been asking for since I started putting videos up on YouTube, honestly. And it's the question of how is it that like a loving God who is omnipotent can not only allow things like violence and genocide, um, yeah, which is a very, something that's very much with like the philosophical or whatever problem of evil. Um, but the question is much more specific in that how can he command these acts? It's one thing for a deity who's all powerful and all loving to say, I'm going to allow that to happen. It's quite different when in 1 Samuel 15, he says, all right, Saul, go attack the Amalekites, place them under the ban, utterly destroy men, women, children, nursing infants, cattle, kill everything. That's very different. And it's something that, I co-hosted a show for a couple of years called the Skylar Fiction Show. And 1 Samuel 15 was the first passage that Skylar went to, and he still does, because it's so difficult to deal with. If you're coming to the text with this understanding or with this interpretation that, this is actual historical writing, these are commands that were given by Yahweh. I'm a very fundamentalist evangelical view, and an inerrancy view. Quite often we'll hold to this as well. It's a very difficult thing to make your way through. And so you can find evangelical writings about this all over the place. There's one, I think, that came out in 2019, 2020, an edited volume that deals with like this problem, right, of violence. And so for me, I was starting right with the basics. What is the text actually saying? And then trying to address the responses that quite often online, but unfortunately, I think academic apologists give to these divine commands of violence and genocide. So the two questions that I deal with, and I won't, again, there's a lot in the chapter, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but the two questions that I'm trying to answer are the standard apologetic responses of one, the victims of divine violence and genocide were really, really bad people. So they deserved it, right? This was God's justice being brought out and brought upon them. And then the second, failing that sometimes, is wait, this is just ancient Near Eastern war rhetoric, right? This is hyperbole. It's like if you read Paul Copan says it very clearly. Like, when one football team really massacred the other in the game last night. And, does that work? Will that fly? No. And I remember we had John Collins on from Yale Divinity School a couple of years ago now, and we talked about this in a different aspect of it. But that was one of the things that came up is people that say, well, it's hyperbole. And I remember his response to this day, nice try. It's something that sounds good and sounds very convincing until you dig down into the details. So to kind of set the stage for this, I suppose Lawson Younger, who's at Trinity, out in Illinois, in 1990, 1991, wrote a monograph about conquest accounts. And this type of language that we see, this type of ancient Near Eastern war rhetoric. And what he shows, I think, reasonably well, and he hasn't gone without criticism, but there certainly is Near Eastern war rhetoric. Right? This idea that I wiped every soul out, I killed every single one. Not a building was left standing. Right? Sennacherib does this sort of thing, for example. And did he actually do that? When he went down and wiped out that city, did he actually destroy everybody, every living? No, of course not. But this is the type of royal propaganda that you see in the literature. And so the way that this has been used initially was to be able to say, look, we can't just write off the book of Joshua, specifically Joshua 9 through 12. We can't just write this off as completely, lacking in historical value for this reason. Because, so often in the book of Joshua, it says, we destroyed absolutely everybody. And some of the people that get destroyed in the book of Joshua show back up in the book of Judges. And so it's like, well, wait a minute. Like, if they were utterly wiped out, how is it that they show back up in the next book? And so, does this solve the problem? No, I don't think it solves the problem. But it was an argument that was made. Look, you can't just say that because the text says that everybody was wiped out, that means that, when you see them later, that means there's some historical contradiction that's going on here. Instead, this is ancient Near Eastern war rhetoric. Now, there's a problem immediately that shows up that I don't think people recognize that use this argument. Because the way that I hear it is, oh, wait a minute. God, sure, it says, here in 1 Samuel 15 to wipe everybody out, but we know that this is just war rhetoric. This is just hyperbole. So the question that I ask back is, tell me what the hyperbole is. That's a very difficult question to answer. I know that Skylar and I debated Stuart and Cliff Connectley, who are kind of big names. They go around different university campuses like Harvard and Yale and Berkeley, and they kind of walk around out in the quad and they challenge people, challenge these students on what they believe. And in the debate, Skylar brought up 1 Samuel 15, and he said, how is it that a good God can command something like this? And their response was, well, this is just hyperbole. And I said, great. What was the hyperbole? Because if the hyperbole is what, again, and this is taking this to be this sort of literal, historical hermeneutic that says, this is actually what happened in the past, right? If we had a video camera and went back, you could see Saul getting the command, So what was the hyperbole, Cliff? Was it that Yahweh saying to Saul, go slaughter them, like a coach would say to his team, go slaughter them? Because that was the example that he gave. Because if that's the case, let's say that's the hyperbole, why on earth did Saul get in trouble? Right? You would think that he would have gotten in trouble for killing too many people. Because if you remember the story, he kills everybody except some of the choice animals and the king. So, I mean, gracious, Yahweh should have been pissed, and pissed because he killed he killed people. I mean, that was just war rhetoric, right? I didn't mean that you were supposed to go kill everybody. Or is that rhetoric? Sorry, my 4-year-old is out blowing a recorder just outside the door. But is the war rhetoric understood on Saul's part? Because if that were the case, when Samuel comes up to him and says, "You've been rejected as king because you failed," Saul could be like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, wait a minute. Wait a minute. I mean, he didn't mean that was hyperbole from Yahweh, right? He didn't mean kill everybody. Why is it that this was such a problem?" Well, this narrative rises and falls, and I talk about this in the book. It rises and falls on the absolute nature of this divine command of genocide. It rises and falls on it being something total. It has to be that the narrative is intending in the story that everybody has to be killed. It has to be an all-encompassing thing, because the narrative doesn't make sense otherwise. It becomes incoherent. So there's a difference between utilizing the hyperbole, the war rhetoric argument, to say there's not a historical contradiction here, and we shouldn't be reading this as taking these texts as this sort of literal historical through this interpretation that some more fundamentalist scholars would do. It's another thing for that fundamentalist scholar to turn around and say, or that evangelical scholar, that particular branch of evangelical scholar, to say, well, I mean, it's just hyperbole, so it didn't really mean that in the story. So because it doesn't work that way. These narratives, the narrative with the story of Jericho, with Achan and Rahab, the story requires it, right? And I talk about that in the book, because it rises and falls. It hangs on the all-encompassing nature of the ban. So that's sort of dealing with the hyperbole in broad strokes. The other thing that it deals with is, well, they deserved it. So when you see something like 1 Samuel 15, there are lots of people that will turn around and say, well, I mean, do you know who the Amalekites were? They were terrible people, right? They worshiped other gods. That's usually the thing that people do in the Old Testament that gets them killed. They worshiped other gods. Is that really something we should be genociding over? No. But that's the reaction, right? They were just really, really wicked people. And what I do in the book is sort of briefly say, look, when you're talking about like the Canaanites, the big thing that everybody talks about is child sacrifice, right? They're sacrificing their children to Molech. Well, in volume 1 of the Atheist Handbook, I present this case, right? And I say, what is it? What evidence do we actually have of child sacrifice in Canaan? We just don't have much of anything. The evidence that we do have is much, much later, right? Comes from like the 7th to 2nd centuries BCE, and comes from Punic colonies, right? Which have a connection to Canaan, right? To the Phoenician coast, but it's not the same, right? And so if you're making a positive case for something like child sacrifice in the 2nd millennium, you're doing it based on the biblical texts alone. And can we do that? No, I don't think that's not it's not good scholarship. But for me, in this chapter, I sort of sidestep it and say, all right, I'm gonna give it to you, right? Let's look at what other Near Eastern, like royal inscriptions and other literature. Do they do the same thing? In other words, do we have Middle Assyrian and Neo-Assyrian kings saying things like, my God, Asher, commanded me to go and to wipe out and to destroy and to punish these other people groups because they rebelled and they sinned against my God, Asher? And Asher had extended a benevolent arm to them, and they rebelled against him. And so they were deserving of that divine wrath through the instrument of me. Yes, we do. And so the question is, when that's pointed out, in the chapter, I just sort of pose the question to the apologist. So are you cool with Tiglath-Pileser III doing that shit? Like, is that good? Because the text says it, and the text says that it's because they were wicked and they rebelled and they sinned against another deity, this guy's deity, and that was deserving of that. Are you okay with that? Of course, the answer will be no. Then why? Well, it's because my God is the real God, right? And now we've moved past the argument of they're really wicked, and we've gotten to this sort of case of special pleading, right? It's because you believe that your God is the right one. He believed that his God was the right one. And so now the arguments move away from, this ancillary point about violence and move back to, okay, demonstrate that yours is the right God. And of course, that's a very difficult argument to make. But that's sort of the angle that I take. And last thing maybe that I'll say about it, sort of in that vein about special pleading, is people are very protective of their holy text. And they often see it through those rose-colored glasses. I put out a tweet a couple weeks ago that said, a man, how did I word it? A man brought down a place of worship through a suicide act, brought the building down on 3,000 worshipers in a suicide act. His name was Samson. And got a little bit of pushback from that tweet, understandably so. But if you were to say to somebody, hey, there was a guy and he went into a building where 3,000 people were worshiping, and he destroyed the main supports of the building, and the building came crashing down on top of these people and killed these people that were worshiping their God in a suicide act. What would you call that? And people say, it's terrorism, right? It's horrible. But with Samson, well, but the Philistines, they're really bad, right? And Yahweh, he was with him. And so, of course, you read Hebrews chapter 11, there he is, right? He's among the great heroes of the faith. But it's because we're coming, when we see Samson, we're seeing Samson as this great hero because we already worship that deity and we already think very ill of the Philistines, right? But that's what terrorism, this type of terrorism functions, is based on that sort of idea. And unfortunately, this type of perception, this type of, running to the defense or to the aid of somebody like Samson in the Old Testament doesn't just happen on social media. So I give an example of a very good scholar, Daniel Block, who has a wonderful, for the most part, 2-volume commentary in the New International Commentary on the Old Testament series on the book of Ezekiel. I mean, it's a wonderful, very thorough commentary set. But even he can't get past some of these problems. So he has an excursus on Ezekiel chapter 16, and this is the chapter where there's this metaphor given about Yahweh as the man who finds Israel in its own blood, like as a baby on the side of the road, left for dead, and takes it and cares for it and raises it up, gives it all these gifts and fine clothing, blah, blah, blah. And it becomes his wife. And she takes these gifts, metaphorically, right, and gives them to other lovers. And Yahweh's response in Ezekiel 16 is violent, right? And so Daniel Block, when he deals with this, he deals with it there, and then he deals with it in another article in that edited volume I mentioned earlier, deals with these problems of divine violence. And what he says is essentially, before we deal with these problematic passages, we have to make sure that we're seeing the violence through the lens of Yahweh's grace. It's insidious. We have to view the violence through the lens of his grace. And I say in the chapter, do that anywhere else. Listen, battered wife, you have to see the things that your husband did through the lens of his grace, right? How good was he to you earlier in this marriage? I mean, gracious, last year he took you on that trip to Hawaii, right? You can't just think about the beating that he gave you. You have to see that through all the good things that he's done. Come again? Like, time to find another counselor, right? We don't do this anywhere else in life, but we do it here because there's this presupposition, there's this conclusion that we're starting with, that God is perfect and he's holy and he's justified. He's justified in doing what he does. And even if it's to say, look, we know that he has morally sufficient reasons, we just don't know what they are. It's still beginning with the conclusion and working backwards. And so I try in this chapter to work through some of these very problematic passages that deal with divine commands of violence, and to say, do these standard apologetics work? And of course, the answer is no. I don't think that they do.